Welcome to Unite and Rise 8.5. What it is, why it matters, and what does it mean to you? That's exactly what we'll uncover in this powerful web series. I'm Celina Stewart, CEO of the League of Women Voters, and I'm thrilled to invite you on this journey as we talked about how everyday people just like you can stand up, speak out, and take action to defend democracy. In each episode, we'll hear from experts of democracy, activism, and movements, people on the front lines of change. Together, we'll learn how to hold power accountable, protect our rights, and mobilize for the future we believe in. This is our moment to unite and rise. Let's get started. What makes movements win? And why is this moment so critical? In this episode, we sit down with Dr. Erica Chenoweth, one of the world's leading experts on civil resistance, to talk about and explore the strategies that make people-powered movements possible. Drawing from decades of global research, we'll break down why nonviolent movements are more effective than violent ones, and how today's organizers can learn from the past. We dive into Erica's new book, Bread and Roses, Women on the Frontlines of Revolution, which reframes our understanding of who really leads transformative change and what it means for the fight ahead. Plus, Erica will close us out with one powerful seed of wisdom to plant for the movement and for our next guest. So who is Erica Chenoweth? Erica Chenoweth is one of the world's leading scholars on civil resistance and the power of people-driven movements. A professor at Harvard University, they are the author of Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, and co-author of the groundbreaking Why Civil Resistance Works, which reshaped how we understand nonviolent struggle by showing it's twice as effective as violent movements, and how this all creates lasting political change. Their work has been called essential reading for organizers, policy leaders, and really anyone who wants to know about democracy. Erica's newest book, again, Bread and Roses, Women on the Front Lines of Revolution, spotlights the critical and often overlooked role that women have played in movements for justice across the country and throughout history and the world. Erica, welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much. Great to see you, Celina.
Likewise. Okay, you ready to just jump right in?
Let's do it.
Okay. I've got a few questions for you that I want to tap into your big brain. So you've studied revolutions across time and geography. What are the non-negotiable ingredients of successful people-powered movements today? And are we in a moment that's ripe for one now?
Great question. I think that if we look back on hundreds of data points over the last 125 years or so around the world, we can see that in movements where people are trying to demand or improve democracy by ousting an autocratic government or by creating territorial independence against a colonial regime or something like that, what we've seen is really four key factors that explain the movements that win versus the movements that are defeated. And the four factors include the ability to get a very broad base of the society engaged and involved in mass participation. And that then leads to the second key factor, which is the ability to use that mass participation to begin to elicit defections from within the pillars that support the autocratic system. And so that would be, the sort of bureaucracy, the civil service, the security forces, economic business elites. You could have state media in some context. Every country has sort of a range of pillars that uphold the status quo under authoritarianism. And the movements that have won and have transitioned into democracy have leveraged people power to begin to pressure people in those different pillars of support to stop cooperating with authoritarianism. And so we've seen in many kind of spectacular displays over the course of history how even some modest shifts within key pillars can really shift the whole balance of power. The third thing successful movements have done is they have innovated their tactics and used a lot of creative ways of refusing to cooperate or go along with what they believe to be immoral or unjust. And so they haven't just done protests, but they've also engaged in economic, social, or political non-cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth thing that successful movements have done is they've maintained discipline and resilience, even as repression has escalated against them, because movements that actually are winning
Mm-hmm.
are almost sure to experience some forceful reaction
Mm-hmm.
from the autocratic forces or their supporters. And so movements that win are able to both expect and anticipate and plan for that escalation and then respond to it in a way that assures that they are still able to proceed with their plans rather than
Mm-hmm.
being really thrown off course.
Okay.
So, to your question of are we in a moment now that's ripe for a movement that might exhibit those factors? I think that every country at every time has the potential to see a people power movement, and it's extremely unpredictable what will kind of tip the balance over to where enough people kind of mobilize together and in these effective ways. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and yet a lot goes into it, right? So a lot of people need to come together. There needs to be a lot of coordination, planning, preparation, training, popular education. All
Yeah.
of these things kind of feed
Yeah.
into an enabling environment that then provides a more robust place for civil society to mobilize effectively.
Okay. That is so interesting to me. So, under your second point, just for listeners who may not be familiar with these terms, what do you mean by defections? What does that
Yeah,
mean?
that's such a good question. It's one of those terms that political scientists use a lot that actually describes a huge range of behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And that range of behavior can include things like, let's say, security forces receiving an order to fire live fire on an unarmed group of protesters.
Like
And
LA?
just,
You mean
yeah,
like the
like in
LA
LA,
situation? Oh, wow.
yeah,
Okay.
there were rubber bullets and
Yeah.
other less than lethal munitions, right? But
Right.
yes, let's say they receive an order to
Oh.
do that, and a defection would mean that they either pretended not to hear that, they did something
Mm.
else, they refused to carry out
Oh,
the
okay.
order. So defection just means they don't go along with what they're expected to do, and sometimes this can be very like under the radar, like they have plausible deniability of, oh, we just didn't know we were supposed to do that,
Right.
or I didn't hear it,
Didn't
my
understand.
earphones are out.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then sometimes it's much more overt, and even in some cases, we've seen over history where, say, security forces put down their weapons and join the protest. This has happened before in Thailand, for example,
Mm-hmm.
in the past. And then, but it's not just security forces, and I don't want people to get the impression that that's the only pillar that matters. In fact, in a lot of societies, it's not wise or strategic to
Mm-hmm.
really focus on security forces. Sometimes it's more like the economic and business elites
Mm-hmm.
who are the most critical sector. This was true, say, in South Africa
Mm-hmm.
under the apartheid regime, where it
Oh.
was never going to be the case that the security forces were going to ignore their orders, but the business and economic community started to become much more. They experienced much more pain because of the
Mm.
extreme levels of withdrawal of economic activity that was occurring both domestically because Black townships were refusing to buy and
Yeah.
also engaging in strikes. And
Mm-hmm.
then the international community was also imposing sanctions on the apartheid regime, and multinational corporations were divesting from the country. And so there's a
Okay.
huge amount of capital flight. And that is economic and business sector was the crucial pillar to go to the National Party, which was the apartheid party, and say you must reform and do business with the ANC and unban the ANC and begin negotiations for a peaceful transition here, because the pathway that we're on is complete collapse or
Yeah.
civil war, and neither of those is tolerable, so we have to do something else, right?
Okay.
And so I think that that's an example of kind of a chain reaction.
Mm-hmm.
But defection just means basically they shift their loyalty
Mm-hmm.
to what was expected of them and obeying that. And they'd start to do really any number of other things
So that's
other than that.
so interesting to me because under the third pillar, you talked about non cooperation. So does defection and non cooperation depend on who it is and their power in a situation?
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting point. I think it is true that sometimes a defector is the non-cooperator. Other times it's ordinary
Oh,
people not cooperating that's actually producing the material costs that induce the defection. So
oh,
like in the South Africa story, right? The non-cooperation started as, economic boycotts and strikes. Um, and then the international community's response. And then the defectors stopped cooperating with the system too
oh.
because they were experiencing the economic pain of grassroots non-cooperation.
I love that. So since we're talking about people, that leads me to my second question. In Bread and Roses, you center women at the front lines of revolution. What have we historically misunderstood or worse, erased about women's leadership in movements?
Yeah, so this is based on research that I've done with Zoe Marks, and in our book, what we are arguing is that we have really underestimated how important mass women's participation has been
Mm-hmm.
in the fates of these nonviolent campaigns over the course of history, like whether
Yeah.
they succeed or fail, and in the type of country that emerges afterward.
Oh.
So what we figured out is that if you actually look at the domestic composition of nonviolent movements over the course of the last 120 years or so, that those in which women were participating in roughly equal numbers to men in the
Mm-hmm.
front line roles in the
Mm-hmm.
movement, which means like imagine a mass demonstration, and from what you can tell, there's like half of the people there are women and half are men, and it's just sort of like a very multi-gendered um,
Mm-hmm.
space. Those movements were much more likely to win, that is, oust their autocrat or result in territorial independence, like
Mm-hmm.
in the anti-colonial cases, and they were much more likely to have emerged democratic. And if you think
Oh.
about why that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the short-term successes, it makes a lot of sense because if women are excluded from people power movements or relegated to more, say, support roles that are more
Mm-hmm.
aligned with gendered expectations of their social role in a movement, then the movement loses all of that people power, right?
Mm-hmm.
It just is
Yep.
depriving itself of, as they say, half the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing, though, is that we found kind of remarkably that when women were participating in parity like that, roughly equal numbers to men, the movements themselves were way larger. So, like 11 times larger.
Oh, wow.
Um, because when women participate in large numbers, they activate their social networks as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's much more likely to be a collective participation.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, because of the kind of social and public expectations of women's role in society, even in very conservative places, one of the things that's so interesting about our data is that we find that the more women are participating in those higher numbers, the more likely we are to see those security force defections in particular.
Mm. Okay.
And the more likely we are to see the movement maintain discipline, even as repression escalates. So those are two of the key factors,
Mm-hmm.
that explain the success of these movements. We also have a hunch that movements that have very large numbers of women participating are probably more creative. They probably are able to draw on the social knowledge
Mm-hmm.
of how women engage with and participate in the economic, political, and cultural aspects of society to innovate tactics that are really clever
Mm-hmm.
and impactful.
Yeah.
And so there are lots of examples of that over history, and so that checks all of the boxes, right? More people, more
Mm-hmm.
likely to induce defections, more tactically innovative, although that's more of kind of a qualitative observation, I'd say, and then more likely to elicit security force defections. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that the bottom line is that we have not appreciated fully that the sort of crucial nature of the inclusive dimension of
Mm-hmm.
nonviolent resistance as part of why it succeeds.
Yeah.
and that women's participation is so essential in activating those other mechanisms that make these movements win.
Well, that's part of the reason why we launched the campaign, the Unite and Rise 8.5, because we are a women-centered, women-led organization, and we thought it was critical for a women's organization to really be the backbone of any movement that happens in this time. And so I appreciate what you said, because it really just, I think, hopefully inspires others. It really inspires me to know that we're doing the right thing at the right moment in time and with the use of our resources, people, time, and energy. So you mentioned that there's lots of examples about women in particular and movements. Can you tell us a story, hopefully one that we do not know, of a grassroots movement led by ordinary people that changed the course of a nation? You had some examples that you started with, but I wonder if you want to give a dedicated example here.
Sure. So there's a very interesting story about the origins of the tactic of the boycott. And it relates to this question exactly. So the boycott as a method first emerged in the late 19th century in Ireland, when it was still a British colony.
Okay.
And the way it came about is that there was a lot of agitation, certainly toward the second half of the 19th century, for Irish independence. And that escalated in a huge way after the famine, because the way that the British crown related to the Irish at that point was totally extractive, even though the famine had wiped out a huge number of people, like an astonishing number of people died during the famine. And so, but the British landlords, who still owned all of the farms and the manors and things like that, would still come and extract rents from the population, right?
Oh, wow.
And if people couldn't pay their rent, they might kick them off the farm. And so, like, the level of kind of immiseration was intolerable.
Yeah.
And so there was all kinds of interesting things building and organizing taking place. And there was the Irish Land League that was agitating and trying to build alternative institutions and push for independence. And it was shut down.
Wow.
By the British government because it was threatening status quo so much. But what the authorities failed to do was, what they did was they underestimated the Ladies' Land League. And the Ladies' Land League was basically the women's auxiliary, right, is what they would call it at that
Love
point.
it. I love it.
Right. And they were like deeply aware of all of the ways in which the ongoing strife with the British colonial rule was affecting families and the survival of their children and their neighbors and everything. And so they would do all kinds of things, like when tenants would be expelled from farms, they would build temporary structures and try to organize food to feed these people. And they would like squat in areas that they were like not allowed to be and like protect people, right, who were living there. But then they also realized there was this one particular landlord named Captain Charles Boycott, who was going to come to visit and extract his annual rents. He only came like maybe once a year to come and get his rents and then go back to Britain. And it was in County Mayo, and they decided they were not going to cooperate with him. So when he came, they were not going to open his buildings for him or clean the house or tailor his clothes or sell him food or engage with him in any way. And so he showed up and was subject to a totally coordinated ostracization campaign. And he never came back. And that's where we got the term boycott.
I was just about to say, did you just introduce us to how boycott came to be named boycott?
That's why it's called that.
Oh my God. You know, I did not know that. How did I not know that?
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't, but like what's really interesting about it is that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, like there was less talk about anti-dictatorship and more about anti-colonial movements, right? Which was their version of anti-dictatorship. And one of the most important of these campaigns, which would start just a few years later, was Gandhi's campaign
Oh,
in
yeah.
India. He first experimented with
Hmm.
campaigns in South Africa,
That's right.
where he was a young lawyer, and then moved to India to help lead the Indian independence movement. And he and others were very aware of
Mm.
the way the Irish had tried to liberate themselves from the British. And
Hmm.
it was very inspiring. And it was the
Yeah.
non-cooperation. The like, we
Hmm.
will not give, we will not pay attention to, we will not answer questions, we will not sell, we will not provide,
Hmm.
that actually like helped to inspire many of the techniques of the non-cooperation campaign. And
I love
I
that.
feel like I read somewhere that Gandhi had said that he was more inspired in some ways by the Irish independence movement than say by the suffragists, even in
Oh,
part because he
so
found this
sad.
to be such a I know, but he found it to be such a strategic tool.
Hmm.
um, and he was inspired by the suffragists too, but he found it so disciplined and so
Hmm.
strategic and
Yeah.
so impactful that it was very generative for him. So
Well,
anyway, this is just to say,
don't lose hope,
some
suffragists out here. We just have some work to
yes,
do, some discipline, right? That's going to take us to that next level.
I have no doubt about it that the suffragists themselves also learned from the boycotts of the Irish independence movement.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to go
Yeah.
back and look at, but that's in your book, I think. Didn't you talk about this? I remember listening to your book and hearing this
Yeah, so
part of this.
Zoe and I will talk about it in our book, and I think I might have made reference to it in an earlier
Earlier.
work as well. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that is fascinating. Before we let you go, because unfortunately time goes so fast when you're talking to brilliant people. Before we let you go, we end every episode with a small little ritual. We ask each guest to leave a seed, a thought, a question, a challenge, or a truth, something for the next person in this movement to hold, water, or wrestle with. So I'm going to ask you, what seed would you like to plant today for our audience?
I think the observation I would make is that it's really ordinary people living where they are,
Mm-hmm.
working together in their communities and leading their communities as leaders,
Mm-hmm.
that make or break the future of our societies, right? And
Yay.
so I think what that just means is like we don't have to. There's no need to sort of wait for some mythical like leader or figurehead to emerge to uh, to 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 tell people what to do. I think people living where they are, and
Absolutely.
understanding what needs to change where they are and working with others where they are to make those changes is what makes it all work. And so I would simply say, as a specific challenge,
Mm-hmm.
the next time like one of your listeners is going to go to an organizing meeting or go to a protest or go to a training or go to like an opportunity for public education or anything like that, to bring
Mm-hmm.
someone with them,
Amen
bring
to that.
someone with them who otherwise wouldn't go, right? And they don't
Yeah.
have to be somebody who's ideologically opposed or anything. Like, just start with people who you think might like it, but you've never seen
Maybe.
them be active. Start there.
Right.
and,
I
uh,
always
and
say
that's what
that
I'd
too.
say.
I
Yeah,
thank you, Erica. I always say that too. We keep waiting for some great hope and someone to help us. And it's like it's no Calvary coming. We are the help that we need.
that's right.
So thank you so much to all of you listening. May that seed take root in your mind, in your conversations, and your courage. Let's see. So I just want to say thank you, Erica, for joining me for this episode of Unite and Rise, our very first. So you are a launch pad. Thank you.
Amazing.
The fight for our democracy is powered by everyday people, just like you said, people like you, and people who choose to get informed, get involved, and take action. In our next episode, we'll dive into what activism looks like today and explore how each of us can make an impact right now. Until then, remember, democracy is strongest when we unite and rise together. Thank you, everybody. See you next
Thank you,
time. Thank you,
Selena.
Erica.
Thank you.